everyone. My name is Jacob Fine. I'm president and founder of the Universe Discovery Project. Today I'm here with my co-exec, Hila Akbari, and Professor Mark Bayfield, who's an RNA biologist, who's going to be joining our discussion about the origins of life and discussing what science can tell us about it and what we currently know and what we could learn. So Hila is going to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Hila Akbari. I'm the vice president of UDP.
And Dr. Bayfield, if you want to say a few words about yourself so we can be familiar.
My name is Mark Bayfield. I'm an associate professor at York University. I've been at York for about 10 years now. I study molecular biology, biochemistry with a focus on RNA biology and RNA binding proteins.
Great. Okay, so let's get started. Yeah, so I'm going to ask the first question. Could you please begin by explaining what is abiogenesis and why is it so important?
Abiogenesis, I guess a reasonable definition would be the study or the understanding of how life came to be from non-life. So how did life start? When thinking about abiogenesis, one thing you may first want to define is what is life, right? So we are really used to living systems in and around us today. We have a generally good idea of what a living system is, a human, a plant, a bacteria. But when life was to begin, then it's to be expected that it probably didn't look like it looks now. And so it probably consisted of an initial set of chemical reactions that came together, which eventually led to something that approximates what we expect life to look like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so when we talk about abiogenesis, it's really kind of that question, that study of how a living system or the beginnings of living systems could have emerged from non-living things or chemical reactions that are most decidedly not living, right? There's chemistry that happens in and around us all the time, but we wouldn't necessarily call them chemistry of living things, but eventually that emerged, and it's kind of that question. And why is it important? It's really one of the things that we understand the least. It's really one of the biggest scientific and certainly biological questions that are out there. How did life start? We don't really know.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll just build up on that a little, and then we'll move on to some of the other questions. But a lot of great stuff. So again, we're talking about what is life. That's a big question, and to me, to a student of biology like myself, I think the question "what is life" is kind of like asking, well, what makes something a toddler or a teenager or an adolescent? And because why I say this is because it's kind of like a gradient. I think thinking of it like that is a good metaphor, kind of, because you have viruses, you have bacteria, then you have eukaryotes, and then you move up the ladder. Not to be too teleological, but just that idea of just there is a gradient of complexity, I think, and you have chemical reactions going to viruses and moving up. So maybe just talking about that is there's an evolutionary kind of spectrum, I guess, if that makes sense.
It's a nice analogy. We know what we think of when we think of a toddler. We know what we think of when we think of a teenager and an adult. But it's a little bit harder to then define when does a toddler become a kid, or when does a child become a young adult. It's a little bit fuzzy in that sense. We know what life is. We know what life looks like. It's a little bit harder to set a border of, okay, this was non-living and now it is living.
Right.
And so the nature of those chemical reactions, we know what types of chemical reactions occur in living systems, but when life, it was almost certainly a series of chemical reactions that had to progress in complexity. And then at one point, we kind of start to agree that, yes, this is starting to look like the things that
But what's that thing? So,
right.
A toddler might say their first words. What's the life equivalent of that? I mean, to me,
right.
It would be something like self-replication. If that
Replication is a big one. Replication is a huge element of what we associate with living systems. There's a sense of, basically duplication or of self. So basically there's a template or a set of chemical structures, at least, at the very minimum, that can create new versions of those same or similar chemical structures in the concept of kind of propagation. There's kind of a growth of a population, even if it's not really a living thing as we currently envisage it. That's one of the things. There's a sense also of consumption. There's kind of an idea of there are resources in the environment that would be harnessed or used in a way so as to move in a direction of replication or something like that. Something that's kind of, so a crystal will grow, but that doesn't really count as living things because there's no increase in complexity. There's not really any new, I guess, individuals coming about in the same way. So, there's kind of these ideas of things that are associated with living systems, but, it's a spectrum of things that kind of have to come together before we start saying, yeah, that's really starting to get at what we would expect out of a
right.
life form.
Right. The next question I think fits that. So maybe.
Yeah. I just have a quick question about the concept of life. Could you, just because like the analogy you gave, I just want to quickly, we mentioned chemical reactions that occur. So, but someone could, for instance, argue that like inside a volcano, there's all these chemical reactions that occur. And then you mentioned the crystal, like the crystal grows, but could you say that like change and variation over time and how like that crystal, as it grows, it's still the exact same crystal, but a single like eukaryote, as it grows throughout time, it might not look the same in 100 years. It could have, evolutionary, it'll have mutations and look different, whereas that crystal could still be the same, like, emerald or the same thing, or that volcano will still be the same volcano, but that eukaryote could have changed into, so like that change is kind of what also segues into what we identify as life versus what is not.
So the early chemical reactions that we would associate with a living system, they in itself, they may not be all that different than the chemical reactions you might find in a volcano or in a crystal growing. They may not, they're fundamentally chemical reactions that follow the normal laws of thermodynamics.
Right.
But what makes them a little bit, I guess, unique or important in the context of this conversation is this idea that there's typically some version of a templated propagation, okay? So there's kind of a version of something that is capable of creating a second or more versions of that same thing. There's inherently a high degree of complexity there that is maintained. And that's one of the things that's critically important about kind of living systems is most chemical reactions move toward, all chemical reactions follow the laws of thermodynamics, obviously, but it's much more likely to go towards systems of greater entropy. So that which happens in a volcano is going to be just basically a downhill reaction of lots of things decomposing or breaking down or exploding or who knows what. Whereas in a living system, there's a certain degree of order that is maintained through like a passage of that order to a progeny.
Right.
And so that's kind of makes one of the things definitely that makes life special. And that's something that has to kind of occur in this kind of iterative order. That's something that Jacob brought up also, is this idea that as time goes on, as this iterates several times, there's the opportunity there to tweak that chemical reaction this way or that way a little bit, such that you increase the efficiency or you increase the likelihood that it's going to happen. And so there's kind of a gradual escalation of kind of the order of the system, such that, kind of you can scaffold more and more interesting chemistry onto that, I guess.
One thing you brought, we'll move on to the next question soon, but just a quick point. After I say this, we could move on, I guess. But you mentioned that chemical reactions head towards entropy, right? That's true. That's just how thermodynamics works. But
They tend to. Yeah, I mean, unless there's an enthalpic compensation. That's right.
Exactly. So the key thing about life is that a system can get more ordered by thermodynamics, but a system and its surroundings must get disordered.
That's right.
So as long as the net, and so not to be too technical, but you could have a system that gets more ordered as long as the surroundings get more disordered to compensate, and you're still okay with thermodynamics. So that's right.
The net energy change of the system must, there must be a general decrease of free energy. The free energy of the system must be spent, and that's either by decreases in enthalpy, or we can argue burning or heat loss, or increases in disorder.
Yeah, so the universe has to get more entropic, but the system itself, a part of the universe, like let's say a system of life, could get more orderly as long as the rest of it gets more disorderly. That's what you need.
And that is, that's an interesting point to bring up. That is probably, to my thinking, the most fascinating element of life, is that it is this, we have these laws of thermodynamics that require the free energy of the system for things generally to move towards disorder. And yet we have life, which is the absolute extreme opposite of that. By virtue of the interesting things about how life works, while holding to the laws of thermodynamics, we've created these highly ordered systems, incredible complexity, which in a fashion, obviously it does happen, but it's not what you would necessarily think would happen easily. And that's why I guess it takes so much time, right? So you basically have invested energy over billions of years to create these complex systems. And you have to be able to evolve from one ingredients of complexity, right? You kind of scaffold increasing complexity onto a pre-existing system.
Like how
the year 2020, where there's this amazing ecosystem of life.
It's like how ecosystems emerge and how zygotes become philosophers after 40 years. So it's like it's just a bunch of gradual incrementations of processes happening, and that's something like that would be how life probably evolved if it wasn't some alien that came out.
From let's say the first living system as we recognize it today to today, we have a reasonably good idea of how that could occur.
Right.
This is basically just getting into Darwinian evolution, and the evidence for that and the mechanisms by which that would occur are very well understood, and there's unbelievable amounts of evidence for that. We're in a fashion we're past that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But how it starts, that's still very much a going concern. Those initial chemical reactions to get it going. Mm-hmm. I'd say the most accurate way of framing it is we have some ideas as to how it could have happened.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we know how it did happen.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the challenge of that is it's really hard to get evidence from that period of time. This is at the beginning of the formation of life billions of years ago.
3.5 billion years, yeah.
And that's right. And one of the prevailing theories, and almost it's very probable, is that these very early versions of life forms were subsequently consumed by higher versions of life forms. And so it's as though the evidence has kind of been destroyed. We don't really necessarily have a fossil record for those early things. As the raw materials for getting those first chemical reactions going, as they were generated, they were subsequently consumed. And so it's hard to know exactly how it happened, even though as time goes by, even in the last 20, 30 years, we've made major advances in understanding how we think it could have happened, but that doesn't mean we're where we understand how it did.
Yeah. So then that really well segues into the next question, is then what can science confidently say about how life began? The parts where it's like,
this is what we
Yeah, like
better,
this
better,
is where you're like, we're certain,
yeah,
even though
or not, or
Certain?
or better.
we want to be certain.
What's not the case? Just because
You know, we're certain about evolution, but it's still only a theory, right? I mean, this come up people joke about.
Right. Well, I think it's important always that theory in science is so much more different than theory used in everyday language.
Sure. No, science, evolution is done. Evolution we've got figured out.
Yeah.
Right.
This is very much not done. This is very much a work in progress, how life began. Like I said, we have reasonably good ideas as to how it could have happened.
But we know how it didn't. Can we say there are ways it didn't happen? Like, I think we could say, you know, we have a collection of possible causes A, B, C, D, E, and F, but we know it's not G, it's not E, or sorry, we know it's not G, it's not Z, it's not X, it's not Y. Like, you could, I think there's some degree of certainty. I mean, you can't be absolutely certain, but you could say with a probabilistic confidence that it couldn't have been certain things.
Well, you know, this is one of the things you know, in science, it's very difficult to prove things didn't happen.
Right.
It's much easier to provide evidence for things that did happen or things that you do think happen. In terms of, you know, scientifically how things happened, you know, the question is, what data do we have arguing for or against this certain things? I mean, there are certain things that I'm not sure I take your meaning exactly. Well, like what do you think didn't happen?
Okay, so a fairy with a magic wand could come down and go boom, like that.
That could have happened, but we don't have evidence for it. You understand? I mean, like I said, it's very hard to show things didn't happen.
So, but
we have no data for that.
Everything we know about thermodynamics and physics, you can't assemble a cell from. There's no mechanism by which a wand can exert joules in a direction with some displacement, and
that would be an extraordinary claim. I think the best way is there's several sayings that are helpful for this. That would be an extraordinary claim. You're right. There is no data for that, and yet that is an extraordinary claim. And so that would require extraordinary evidence. Right. There would have to be, and there's no evidence for that. You can say that you think it was a flying spaghetti monster or who knows what, but there's zero scientific backing for that. And so, again, you don't want to tell people that there's scientific evidence that it didn't happen, because that puts you at a disadvantage. Then people say, well, what is your scientific data? Prove to me that it didn't happen. And when I say I can't, now it makes it look like I was wrong. Well, I'm not wrong. I have no confidence that that was the way anything happened, because there's no evidence for it. That's the way the scientific method works. You have to present a case and collect the data and present the data, and then refine your model based on the data, and propose experiments or propose things to look for after that. And so it's just, there's no scientific basis for those things.
And you could say, all right, but you could say, given what we know, like given everything we know about thermodynamics, physics, chemistry, biology, which in 2,000 years might be different, but given what we know now, today, such an explanation doesn't have any merit whatsoever.
Correct. It has no scientific merit.
There's no reason that will help us in any way by thinking like that. And it just,
you wouldn't want to base your policy decisions on that idea,
because we're all about probability.
There's no scientific basis for it. There's no evidence for it. And so if you were to base your scientific, if you're going to base your policy on that, then you're probably going to
technically speaking, every null hypothesis ever has a probability of being true.
Exactly. People don't get this.
It's just so small. We don't.
What you're saying is there's a chance.
Yeah.
Like people don't. You know, this is why people get afraid of flying in planes, but don't worry about getting in their car.
Right.
Getting in your car is far more dangerous than getting in a plane. But you know, they don't understand really the ideas of. But they understand the ideas of probability. But they are It's challenging to normalize that in their behavior, you know.
And so, perspective.
We're not really wired that way, I don't think, because
and it is, you know, I think natural for, you know, people to And we've evolved to have these senses that see things, see something. I wonder if this is a little bit where you were going with this. It's not unusual for a human to see something highly ordered and highly complex. And we're not used to seeing things that are highly ordered and highly complex that weren't built.
Yeah.
So there's a tendency to want to assign design to things, even though scientifically speaking, the evidence is not consistent with that.
We were built by selection. You could say that.
Sure.
Anyway, with not
that's when I built as in designed, as in kind of a
just
formative.
A
directed.
question that comes up a lot as like a biology student is like, when we learn about evolution, it makes sense. Like, it makes perfect sense, and it's so easy to grasp the way we're taught it. But then sometimes, even myself, like, I come across something and like I'll send it to Jacob. It's like I find like this snail and this parasite and their like relationship and the birds and like mind control and like all these things are involved, and I just look at it and I'm like, natural selection caused this to happen? Like, it's so hard for my brain to sometimes grasp that, like, all of these relationships, all this complexity, all of it, it's and yet such a simple mechanism.
So like, if you look at a tree, right, exactly, if you look at a tree, it's a tree, it's like, okay, who cares? But if you think about what's happening inside of it, you
how it all,
and you know, it's just a bunch of genes expressing themselves, differential, all these things, like this transcription factor, it goes here. It's just it's so much happening, but it's all, the key takeaways, it's all just a bunch of processes that are iterating again and again and again to make
life has been happening for a long time.
Right.
We cannot even conceptualize the length of time that life has been going on for.
Right.
Yeah.
And the world in 2020 is the sum accumulation, the historical record of every selection process that's happened over a ridiculous amount of time.
Mm-hmm.
This is the legacy of all those adaptations to a niche at a particular time. I've looked at organisms where I've had the same reaction. It's like, how did this ever happen?
Right.
Well, not 12 million years ago, not 73 million years ago, but 65 million years ago, this tweak to this organism helped it be more fit in this context.
Right.
And once that's part of its system, it's not easy necessarily to just get rid of it, especially if other things subsequently get scaffolded onto that, other more complex things get scaffolded onto that.
Right.
Until, and this is what we talk about in evolution, until X number of millions of years go by, and the common ancestor, you can't tell, X and Y, their common ancestor, it's really challenging to kind of see how they originally went together.
Right.
But if you were able to dial the highlight reel back and look at it, you would have seen how that had happened.
And I think that's what makes it beautiful in a way. So it's
very much.
Yeah.
It is beautiful in many ways, I think.
It's
fascinating.
More, I would argue it's more beautiful when you understand it with the simplicity of the iterations. But anyway, I think we should move back to talking about RNA.
Well, I think
unless you want to continue.
No, yeah, it's just the next one is then why do we think that RNA came first?
Okay,
that's
all right. So
and to reiterate, you're an RNA biologist, so that's
you guys play this together however you want later. You're gonna do what you want. So getting back to, we were talking previously about some of these chemical reactions in the prebiotic age. Life is not yet really up and running yet. There are a number of molecules using relatively basic chemistry that can self-assemble in kind of reasonably high quantities using elements that are relatively common, just floating around on an Earth, on a planet that has liquid water and has numbers of salts or organic compounds dissolved in it. And so at some point you're going to get this accumulation of these molecules that are eventually going to give rise, they're going to be kind of the skeletons, or at least the smaller components of things that are later going to become molecules we're used to seeing in living systems. The reason why RNA gets a lot of press, I guess, or a lot of interest, in living systems today, we talked about the idea of propagation, the idea of passing on of self to progeny. And I think most of your audience will have heard of that. That should ring some bells, this idea of DNA, this deoxyribonucleic acid. This is a chemical which encodes a blueprint for a living system, a blueprint for an organism. And that is what is passed on. That's one of the things, but that is certainly passed on through generations. And that's what makes subsequent progeny like their parents, like their progenitors. So DNA is that code that does that. And one of the reasons why people talk a lot about RNA is because, well, number one, RNA building blocks, RNA molecules are molecules that you can make relatively easily in that kind of prebiotic world with just kind of organic compounds and metals and soluble elements floating around. You can, and a bit of energy that could have happened through things like, who knows what, lightning or heat, you can make molecules that are RNA or very similar to RNA. Mm-hmm. And so now we're able to create kind of some of those molecules that we're used to seeing today in living systems. The other exciting thing about RNA, more so than DNA, why people talk about RNA more than DNA, is because it was shown, I guess, on the order of 25 or 30 years ago now, this idea that RNA can catalyze chemistry. RNA can act as a catalyst to promote chemical reactions that otherwise would be difficult to occur, and those chemical reactions are required for living systems to happen. DNA is great as a static, inert ordering of kind of, you can think of it as computer code to give rise to an organism. But other than that, it doesn't do much. Whereas RNA, which is very similar to DNA, not only can it do that same thing, it can have that information that can be passed on to progeny, but it can also catalyze chemical reactions. It can move forward chemical reactions that have to happen for living systems to be able to be living systems. And so this is what's led to this idea of this kind of this RNA world, this idea that RNA was at the start of it. And, you know, we don't necessarily know that it happened that way, but because RNA ticks so many boxes for how we think it would have to start, it's a very popular candidate for how we think it started.
So to like back, that was all great, and just a few things there. So one of the problems, right, is proteins are 3D, but you need proteins to make DNA. And so it's like, well, what came first? How do you get DNA without proteins? How do you get proteins without DNA? They both need each other. And the answer is, well, there's actually a middleman called RNA, which can do, which plays roles in both processes. And there's many of them. And not only that, but also RNA, not like you said, not only carries information, but it can fold in all sorts of ways and do tons of things around the cell, which without your RNAs, you'd be dead, because your RNAs do so much in every cell in your body. There's tRNAs, rRNAs, mRNAs, there's a whole bunch of others, right? And they do so much, and they also can hold information. And so not only that, like you said, they could also act as kind of something like enzymes where they can catalyze reactions. So this guy can, these things can do so much. They can hold information and they can act kind of like enzymes in a reaction. So something like that could have been the first, and then you could have had additions to it, gradual, slow incrementations to the process, and eventually you get something like translation, which is how proteins are made. But that seems to be what it is.
Yeah. So when you look at a living system today, we tend to assign the genetic element, the element of the passage of the information to DNA, and we tend to assign the ability to catalyze chemical reactions that would be otherwise very slow or not able to really happen at an appreciable rate. We assign those functions to proteins, to enzymes. And then, as you mentioned, we get into this chicken and egg problem. Right. The DNA codes for the proteins, but the proteins make the DNA. So which came first? And, again, that gets into this idea of RNA. RNA kind of can do both. RNA can code for things, but it can also do things. And so, again, that's one of the reasons why RNA is so popular for how we think it might have started.
Right. Okay. Do you have the next question?
Yeah. So what good models are there that explains parts of abiogenesis?
Well, yeah, I think we kind of sort of talked
Yeah.
about ribozymes and self-assembly of
Well,
RNA.
the RNA world is definitely the predominant one. The RNA world, this idea that something resembling RNA nucleotides could have been assembled kind of in a non-living system, semi-randomly, through just kind of available elements floating around, some energy. And then once you kind of cycle that up, once you've got a kind of a critical mass of RNA-like molecules that can then come together in the right orientation such that they can start some version of propagation, that's certainly the prevailing theory. Again, not because necessarily we know that's the way it happened, but because it is the theory we have that ticks the most boxes as to what we know would have to happen,
right?
Kind of get it to go.
So there's necessary conditions, and they're satisfied by RNA.
Yes, in a fashion, that's right.
But it's not sufficient.
We might discover some other system, but another reason why we think it's RNA is because living systems today have that. If it was something else, then we would probably have some other understanding of something that is in living systems now, and it would be that other thing that could have started everything. However life started, we tend to think it kind of only happened once. It didn't really, or if it happened more than once in more than one way, those other ways didn't persist. They eventually kind of died off. And because every living system we're aware of now kind of follows the same rules as to how life works. There's a nucleic acid, DNA or RNA template for how the genetic information is stored. You have ribosomes that convert genetic information into proteins. There's not like a competing living system that we're aware of. So we tend to think that however it happened kind of once. How that happened is still not clear. But
it's that gray area that you're still trying to use all of these research to discover.
Yeah, I mean, every year you have scientists that are dedicating their careers to largely using RNA, to adding more and more chemical reactions to the chemical reactions that could have kind of the beginning of the things that started it all, right? So it was back in, I think, the 50s and 60s where they showed that they could make things like nucleotides, DNA and RNA, abiotically. And then later it was shown that we're up to the point now where we're making RNAs from scratch, so to speak, that can do a version of replication. And so we're kind of, I guess, reverse engineering how we think it might have happened.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's going further and further along.
And the other takeaway, I think, is, again, the gradual incrementation of it, right? So you don't have to just have a cell pop into existence. You kind of have each part gradually, slowly, like a
certainly it would have to be that
zygote becoming a baby, right? And just a bunch of slow processes iterating on multiple.
I think it must be that way.
It has to happen.
No way a cell just.
Yeah, yeah. So that's what I meant by the fairy analogy. Is like we can say how it didn't happen. There were probably a bunch of processes that accumulated like a bunch of dominoes. And another thing is, there's another point that I think is important to be made, is the idea that a small change can have a big downstream effect. And that happens in biology all the time. And something like, the last chimp human ancestor 7 million years ago on the path, if you look at a chimp now, there's a couple of genes that control how many times neurons divide, the number of times, the N of divisions. And so if you change those genes a little bit, the N of divisions can actually triple. And so if you do that, you go from, humans have 86 billion, or I can't remember the number right now, but they have a lot of neurons, and that number is triple the number of chimps. So if you change the genes just a little, you can go from, eating bananas and trees to ideologies, political systems, and iPhones. just from a few genes, just by changing a little bit. And you know, the human brain.
I expect it's probably not that one.
It's
change.
not one, but it's
potentially that change had a major effect.
Yeah, right. I don't want to exaggerate it too much, but this is kind of I'm getting this from.
But that's a nice thing to think about when we got back to the previous question about, you know, you look at a plant or you look at a snail or and you wonder how it got that way,
right? And
then you look at the amount of similarity between a human and a chimp. It's exceedingly high. It's far, far, far more similar than it is different.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that small difference kind of leads to what you're talking about, this idea of, yeah, the outcome of certainly how it's changed our planet is massive.
Right.
And we know how little, so or who knows, one person got a virus, transmitted it, one person, and now it's in the millions. So that's just the idea of downstream incrementations, gradual to massive downstream effects. And that's how, so
Absolutely.
Something like that would be how life kind of started in some way.
You can imagine a situation where, and this is the way evolution happens all the time, right? We co-evolve with things like viruses, pathogens, parasites.
Right.
You can imagine a situation where a virus emerges, like COVID or coronavirus.
Right.
Let's say that it was a nastier virus than it is, and that there would be a certain genetic polymorphism that made a particular cohort of humans resistant to it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't know. In 5 years, all of a sudden the entire planet has fixed that genetic polymorphism. That because that conveyed such a substantial survival advantage to people who didn't have that variation. Mm-hmm. And so in a very short period of time, especially when you have these kind of crises, these kinds of very acute selection pressures, you can see a population change in a big way. I mean, there are evolutionary things happening now. We've talked about colony collapse disorder in bees. We've talked about bats fighting off pathogens. If there's genetic variability that is going to convey survival advantages in the face of these threats, these are going to change the mix of the genetic background of that which predominates.
Yeah.
So, you know, it happened very much in 2020 as much as it ever did.
And so that's a point to say, like, okay, well, what if there wasn't enough time for evolution? Well, there was, because these tiny changes can produce massive effects in short time frames, and there's a massive time frame. So both of those two effects together give you
probably selection's happening as much now as it ever did, right? I mean, they talk about you have these major events in the history of the Earth, like when the dinosaurs went extinct, or I would argue human activity in the last 100 years has been as big a stress to this planet as other things. There's the number of species that are going extinct or becoming threatened. Mm-hmm. That creates niches for other species to expand into. There's a huge amount of change that's happening right now based on the stress that is us. You know what I mean? There's probably a lot of evolutionary selection that's occurring right now. This is a big time for that.
Right. Leading into the next question is, can we expect to find life anywhere else in the universe? And I think that's a very big question that all of us
borders the lines of this discussion about abiogenesis. So,
right.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if we didn't. Personally, again, it's one of those things that we don't have exactly evidence for, but we're learning more and more about that which must occur for it to happen. We know that it has to be, or hypothesize will have to be on a planet that's in what we call this Goldilocks zone, an area that's of the right temperature such that it would have liquid water. And the data that are coming out in the last 10 years are suggesting that those types of plants are a lot more common than we thought.
Yeah.
We thought that they might be very rare, but now they're not so rare. There's going to be many of
Exactly. Yeah.
them. So that kind of criterion has now been met.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And now if you have those planets in that right temperature zone, why wouldn't it happen on a planet like that if it happened on Earth? It may only have to happen on a few of them for it to be, yes, life is out there somewhere. It may have taken it almost certainly would have taken a different path. The path that life took on this planet.
But would there be something like a eukaryote, something like a mammal, something like a primate? I mean, that's very subjective. That's very like anthropocentric to think of it like that, because we only have one data set of evolution, because it's only happened in one planet as far as we know.
Yep.
But is there not something? Would there not be like something like a cell, and then something like a eukaryote, and then something like an intelligent, something that can process information and have language ability? Like,
well, this is
and something that would have a Dark Ages period, and then something that would have an Enlightenment period. Like that's very anthropocentric. But I'm saying, like, just in that sense, would there not be? Is there not some tendency for this type of path to happen? Or it could have just been bacteria all the time. Like,
if there are living systems down on other planets, my expectation is that it would have some version of what looks like a cell.
Yeah.
Because, and we talked about this already in a previous conversation,
Mhm.
part of the challenge of getting a living system to run has to do with concentration, has to do with molecules that are going to
diffuse,
propagate a system finding one another. Okay. And so there needs to be boundaries. There can't be infinite diffusion or very large diffusion of these molecules.
Okay.
If your cell is ocean-sized, well, then the two molecules that need to come together are just not going to do that. But once you enclose that in a boundary, now, like a cell membrane, which, like a lot of these things we're talking about, they can form kind of spontaneously, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now it changes the rules of the game. Now these two molecules that need to find one each other almost certainly will at one point find one another, depending on the volume of the cell. Yeah. And so I would anticipate living systems will certainly have some version of what we would expect a cell to look like.
Right.
Yeah.
Whether that would take the same path as a eukaryote, I'm not sure. It's a good question.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Whether that would get to what we call intelligent life. Intelligent life is not that new. Is not that old on Earth. You could argue it's, what are we talking about in intelligent life? Humans? Or are we?
Well, it's hard to define. It's hard to
define something that's got some version of a brain pattern or something.
Right. It's hard to define intelligence, but by intelligence I mean something that has language use, that can solve abstract problems and engage in mathematical and.
That's a very high level of intelligence.
Right. So that's what I mean by that. So would there not be?
That's very recent on Earth.
Yeah,
that's not been around a very long time.
Right. It's a new thing.
Geologically speaking.
But also I was wondering, is like you mentioned before, on our planet, this form of like RNA life was what seemed to have worked on our planet, and that's why we keep finding every living organism has this similarity of these patterns, which is why we say we have this one common ancestor. But is that to say that on a different planet, yes, there's these certain rules that you have to abide by, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the RNA maybe was structured the same way, or if they even have the same nucleotides.
Absolutely.
I mean, right? It could have been.
It wouldn't have like G3P, and not to be it wouldn't have the same Krebs cycle as we have. Like it would.
I mean, I've even heard arguments that like instead of carbon, right, it could be like silicone or like certain other chemicals that can cause life to occur, and it doesn't necessarily have to be the same way it happened on our planet.
Absolutely. So you can imagine a situation, probably not so fantastic an idea. You can imagine a situation where on early Earth, there were lots of these chemicals and lots of these elements, but on a different planet, some of those same elements and some of those same chemicals, but other chemicals may have been in greater abundance or lesser abundance.
Right.
And so if life were to emerge in that other system, it may take a different path based on effectively the raw materials that are available in that place. And so, there's no necessarily a priori reason to expect that living systems on other planets are also going to be, let's say, RNA or DNA or
Right.
protein based.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be surprised a bit how similar they might be, to be honest, unless, and this is a theory that is highly debated. It's or at least people are giving it serious thought. Is this idea that life on this planet may not have necessarily come from this planet? It may have been some sort of a seeding event in which some early version of a life form came in on a meteor and found a planet that was fertile, and it emerged. That just passes the buck as to, okay, where did it
raises the question, where did that come from?
Where did it come before?
Right.
But the only point I'm trying to make is that that might explain why life on Earth may look like life we may find on another planet. They may actually have more similarity than we might have otherwise anticipated, because they were both in a fashion seeded the same way.
Right.
How would, let's say, a hypothetical discovery in like the depths of our own ocean, they find an organism that, for instance, doesn't follow our necessarily our system of life, how would that change like what we know?
Change our worldview completely.
Well,
would we argue that life form is like one of us, or could someone say, oh, it must have came from somewhere else? Like, do you think they would accept that maybe our planet is capable of different life forms, or would they take another approach in looking at it?
I guess we'd have to figure out what they see first before we make a call on that. It would be fascinating. It would be extremely exciting. We would have to basically come up with these kinds of, our definitions of life don't rely on something using DNA or RNA. We've kind of this idea of progeny and propagation and energy utilization. Another organism can do that without using DNA or RNA and these other systems that we're used to seeing, and still be, by those rules, still be a living system.
The molecule, like the point is though, the molecule it happens to use, like the reason it happens to be ATP and not GTP. Well, that I don't want to speculate into that, but the point is the reason why our Krebs cycle looks the way it does, the way we oxidize, the way we get energy from glucose, basically, all those things. The reason it looks that way is pretty arbitrary. It didn't have to be that. There didn't have to be all those same molecules.
It is a legacy of what worked at the time.
Legacy. So it's a legacy of accidental successes, pretty much. In
a fashion, that's right. Correct.
It's like the reason why like the genetic code looks the way it does, the reason why each amino acid goes to each codon is pretty much accidental. It didn't have to be that you had, these letters for this amino acid. It could have been something else. Like, it didn't have to be that way, I assume, right?
No, and even in, we call the genetic code universal, but it's less universal than you think. There are organisms.
There are exceptions, yeah,
where the codons are different.
Like a few are slightly
different.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
In cilia, it's tetrahymena is one of them.
Tetrahymena is big.
So that's
yes.
Mitochondria.
Yeah. But the other point I want to bring up also, because we mentioned evidence a lot. We were talking about that quite a bit, and you said there was no evidence for certain things. I think by evidence, I think it would be nice to kind of say more what we mean by that. So I would say there's two kinds of evidence. There's empirical evidence and rational evidence, and rational or argumentative evidence. As in, empirical is like, I have a data point, I can look at it, and this is the data point. Rational or logical argumentative evidence is based on a series of argumentations, like a logical premise conclusion, like speculations based on good reasons to think something is true. In other words, a hypothesis that seems very logically sound and plausible, that doesn't necessarily need empirical evidence. And not to get into the history of philosophy, but that was what happened in philosophy. There were really two schools of thought that emerged in the 1700s, which you had the empiricists and the rationalists. So there were people that thought you could deduce everything by sitting in a chair and just taking some a priori reasons and getting to the nature of the universe. And then there was some that said, no, we need to actually get out there and look at through experience. You have to look out there and see what's there. But I think both are kind of true and both are needed. I would argue the empirical is a bit more important now. But I think when we're talking about life, the origin of life, it's important to have that, to think kind of logically speaking with premise conclusion. You don't necessarily need to see what was there, kind of, you know? You could speculate based on premise conclusion form. I don't know what you think of that, but that's kind of what I think.
I think both of what you're talking about, both of those kind of lines of reasoning have merit, obviously. When you talk about empiricism, you know, another way of saying that is, if I understand what you're talking about, you know, is you have data. You have basically some version of an understanding of how things are. You've observed, you've made an observation.
Right.
And then using your understanding of how things work, if you can formulate a hypothesis or a rationale for how things could occur, that's also very valuable. Where it becomes science, either of those avenues or directions, or a combination of both of them, you create a hypothesis as to how you think it happens, and then you test it. You have to. That's where you go out of kind of the more philosophical things, and we get into the things that we can test. You make a hypothesis about what occurs. You test that hypothesis by doing an experiment. You take your observations from that experiment and revise your hypothesis, and you do that in this iterative process by which eventually you feel you have a better understanding of how something happens than previously.
Right.
I think both of them have a lot of merit, and we do that all the time. We do that. We observe something strange and think, well, that's the way it happens. And then we also have an idea, okay, well, I understand how this and that and the other thing work, and I'm seeing this other thing, and it makes sense to me that it would go this way. So I'm going to make a hypothesis and test that.
So to bring this into what we're talking about exactly, so about abiogenesis is, okay, we can't get data points of how life started as far as we know, right? We can't really, as far as we know, see what, is that true? Or, I mean,
well, we have some data points. They're just not very, it's not a very exhaustive data set. We have an idea of kind of what elements were around at that time, or what it looked like. We have some data.
So I'll be more, sorry, I wasn't clear, but like, you can't have a fossil of the first molecule.
No, probably not.
That's, so something like that. So you have to kind of argue and make plausible models based on what we know and what processes could have happened in those conditions, right? You can't just fly back in time and look at it. You kind of have to use what we know. Like, there's a little bit of data, but we're logically argue and analyze what we think. I think that, I mean, kind of that seems to be.
Well, can't they hypothetically create that situation now, kind of? Like, create that similar environment?
That's what a lot of people are trying to do. They're saying, well, if this is what had to emerge, we kind of know the endpoints. We know kind of, at least we have an idea of what the Earth looked like prior to life emerging, kind of the temperature of the Earth and what would have been floating around. And we know kind of what came out at the other end. We know kind of what living systems looked like, at least at some point.
Yeah.
Kind of that's our earliest chronicled living organism.
Yeah.
And now our job is to try to fill that space between those things.
Right.
And we're doing it with what data we can find, which is challenging, but also, as Jacob's kind of talking about, kind of a rationalization of, okay, well, this would have had to have happened, and so can I basically make that happen with kind of intentionally? I'm going to try to design to show that could have happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great way of doing it. You have to, fold in the caveats. Just because I think it could have happened this way, and just because I was able to show that some version of it was able to occur, which is great, that doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it did happen. Right. It could have happened, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have merit. It's a huge amount of merit. Even if it didn't happen exactly that way, it could have happened a related way.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't necessarily put that oxygen on that sulfur or that over there, but something very similar.
Yeah.
Right. It's kind of more proof of principle type work.
Yeah. So that's what I mean by that. So proof of principle. So we can't watch a movie of how life emerged. There was a movie. It did happen. There was something that happened, right? There was an objective. The tree did fall in the forest, right? Just because no one saw it, it did fall. But we can still have a rational model-based understanding of what is what's the best, most plausible explanation of how it could have happened.
Yes.
So that's what I mean.
No, that's definitely what they're going for, and that's kind of a little bit what I was getting to at the beginning of the conversation we're having, is that even though we don't necessarily know how it did happen, we're learning more and more about how it could have happened.
Right, exactly.
And you know, you have to fold in the caveats of what you mean when you say that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that it's not a hugely important question. Like, I think it's one of the most important questions there is. And so, you know, it'd be interesting to see where we are 100 or 1,000 years from now, and how that understanding has evolved based on what we've been able to see.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I guess to kind of conclude this conversation is that what will science need to do, or where is science headed in finding out more about how life started? So what is the direction that science is headed for that?
You know, there's a few, it's hard to answer that, I guess. Right? There's the hypothesis-driven proof of principle work that is ongoing.
Right.
You know, to get from A to Z, these intermediate steps must have happened, and we're going to try to experimentally show that we can do that in the lab space, and that's what a lot of work is being done.
Right.
And so I anticipate that will continue, and more of those gaps will be filled. It's not clear how far one would get in, say, 100 years, but that's certainly ongoing, and I'm sure they'll make progress. That's one. There's one thing that is really exciting, which has come on in the last 10, 15 years, is our sequencing technologies have become exceedingly powerful, much more powerful than they were previously.
Right.
What that means is that we're now able to sequence the genomes of organisms. We used to really be able to only sequence the genomes of organisms that we could grow or culture. If we couldn't grow it in the lab, it was very difficult to get its genetic information. But we're past that now. It's now possible to sequence, one might think, nearly anything. And so as we acquire more sequences of greater diversity on our planet, I expect we will learn more about kind of the diversity of how life happens on Earth, and we probably will learn a few things, I anticipate, about how, you know, now that we have more data to look at, looking back, we may be able to fill in some of those gaps. So, for example, getting a little bit to what Jacob talked about, they've now managed to sequence and culture this organism, this Japanese group. This came out earlier this year, I think. This Japanese group showed that they have a genome, and they're able to culture an organism that's basically between a eukaryote and an archaea.
Wow.
And so, you know, evolutionarily speaking, this is enormous, right? We're basically starting to move that big jump evolutionarily from bacteria to eukaryotes, or eubacteria,
Right.
and then through archaea.
Yeah.
And so this is really exciting, and
crazy.
This is going to get ramped up in the next 100 years. We're going to be learning more things, and that may help us kind of backdate more accurately how kind of the progression of how things might have occurred. And then there's going to be things we discover that we weren't expecting.
Right.
Yeah.
We may find actual evidence of life on another system, and I'm not sure exactly how we get information as to what that living system looks like using our current technology, but there's going to be discoveries that we didn't see coming, and that's certainly the case the last 100 years. So I'd say it's likely we're going to discover new things. Typically, those big discoveries come along with increases in technology, our ability to see certain thing a certain way. Now, all of a sudden, all these things that you weren't aware of before, now you see them. And so the technological advances in the next 100 years are going to be made in things like detection and measurement of things that we can't see yet. That's going to seed a huge new data sets that is also going to kind of help our understanding of these things. But it's hard to know what that's going to look like, because it's by definition, it's not. We don't know what it's going to look like yet.
Very exciting.
At the end of the 1800s, when I think it was Lord Kelvin said that they know all there is to know about physics. The rest, now we just have to work on improving our measurements. But then, of course, Max Planck and Heisenberg showed that you can't know much about, for Heisenberg in particular, talked about how you can't know where the electron is and how fast it's going at the same time. And that completely abolished what the dogmas were. And, I don't want to say the word dogma, but just the notions of what it was. So again, that we don't know, maybe something like that could happen in biology. But
well, it's certain that in the next, who knows how long, it was only 20 years ago, 25 years ago that we discovered catalytic RNA that can catalyze chemical reactions.
Right.
And that completely changed our idea as to how life could evolve.
Right.
And of course, in the next 100 years, there's going to be similar discoveries, or now, not similar in their content, but equally impactful, equally exciting, equally paradigm changing. And so we're just going to have to see where it goes.
Yeah.
And in synthetic biology, I think that's a promise of where things can be going, like just reproducing. In 2008, they made pretty much a genome implant, if you know, with the bacteria semi-synthetic organism. They took chemicals off a shelf, planted a genome into a bacteria, and then made a new species essentially in some sense. But they also made a yeast chromosome from scratch, but from previous things. But this is an ongoing process, and we're only going to continue to learn more. And that's what makes science so interesting, is we're keeping on to expand, and we learn things we never thought we would have guessed, and we find out we're wrong all the time, right?
Yeah.
But that raises other questions about epistemology either way, like how do we know what we know? Anyway, I think we're getting, this is a good
I'll leave that to you. I'll leave that one to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think life is just the more personally, why I went into biology was because I was so fascinated by life, and I wasn't pleased with some of the answers I had heard when I was younger, and I wanted to learn more. And I think even though I'm only in second year biology going into third, it's the more I learn, the more I realize we really don't know that much. And then the more we go into it, we learn more, but then it's okay, we're missing some more. And it's will we ever truly know? I'm not sure. Am I comfortable with that? Yes. Would I wish to know all the answers? Yeah, but I think
one of the things you're learning is you're learning that which we don't know.
Yeah.
Right? You're learning about the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
And what I think history has told us is that as we fill those gaps, it doesn't happen that we're oh, we're done now. We answer some of those questions, and those answers create new questions.
Always.
Yeah. Right? We don't know. That's the short answer. We just don't know what the next question is going to be, even, or what to even expect. But I still think that given what we know, given our knowledge, we can say, given what we know at this time point t, we can make the best optimal Vmax prediction of a hypothesis what it is, right? So that's what science really, I think, is now, and has always been. It's just making the best possible explanation at some time point t. Going on as t increases, the explanations get better. I think that might be that's accurate, but
yeah.
Anyway.
Thank you so much, for your time.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you again, and it's a pleasure to have you with us. And
this was a very engaging conversation during the quarantine to have.
And it was interesting. It was interesting for me.
Thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Okay, so I'm going to end this. It's going to stop the recording, and we'll see you there. See you later.
Stay safe.
Yeah.
Have a great day, Dr. Bayfield.
Yeah, okay. Great. Nice talking to you both.
Thank you so much.